get us started, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of elements. I think that some of you are misunderstanding the attendance for the class, and I would like to use this opportunity as we close the first module and we're coming to an end on the first half of the semester to remind you that you are expected to watch my boring videos. So when you're not here on Mondays, you need to click on the videos and watch them, all right? Um, it's very important because a lot of the language, the terminology, the explanations are explained in there. So I want to encourage you to all remember that. I pulled up a copy of the syllabus as a reminder, and I'm not going to show it, but if you wanted to open it up, and if you look under the course description, you'll remember that at the beginning of the semester, I pointed you to the hour requirements of invested time in learning in this course, which included your ability to be watching the videos for the times that you're not in class, all right? So this is not a hybrid design where you only come once a week for content. It's a hybrid design so that there are 2 days a week for content, all right? So please keep that in mind. If you also scroll down on the syllabus, you'll take a look at the policies for grading, and 40% of your whole grade at the end of the semester is the module test. All right, so it's the content. I noticed that so far only 3 students in your section, actually in your whole class, have attempted to take the test. So that's okay. That means that you were probably waiting to get all the information before you attempted it. Just recognize that if you want to do both attempts on Sunday, that you have to wait a whole 4 hours between the end of your first attempt and the beginning of your second attempt. And your second attempt will be cut off if it exceeds the time of 11:50 that day at p.m. So please manage your time. If you have questions, please go ahead and send me an email. I respond fairly quickly, and especially now, I will probably reply within 4 or 6 hours of you sending me an email, especially if you're asking a question about content so that I can help you be successful for your test. I do want to just quickly mention that I have approved all of the topics for your term projects. On Monday, I talked about, and it's on video, all of the next steps for beginning your research. And I used some of the topics that your class even submitted as examples for how to do that research. So please watch that video. I also want you to notice that if you are doing any extra credit, all extra credit is due Sunday night, just like the exam is due by Sunday night. And that will then, at that point, give you a really good point of where you are in the class in terms of your grade. Right? I will have the journal graded before you go into taking your final test so that you will have that. The only thing you will not have graded will be your extra credit. Right? So that kind of gives you a standing point to know where you fall in the course. All right? So let's go ahead and do a review. I encourage you to go ahead and open up your laptops or your phones. You may want to follow along with me. First thing I want you to do is to scroll in your Moodle course to where it has the Module 1, Chapter 1 learning objectives. So if you could all pull that up, that that will be helpful for you. This is my checkpoint to make sure that I've covered all these things for you. And it's also your checkpoint to make sure you now understand all these things. First, when you open up that document, look at the very bottom where it has all the terms. Those terms we have talked about throughout the semester. If you don't understand their definitions, the definitions are in your textbook, so you can look them up there and make sure you know what they are before you go in and take the test. There's a lot of terminology expected that you have gained and will be tested on. And some of the questions will give you multiple terminology in one question. And you will have to know what is the correct terminology, what's the correct term in the context of the question, so that you can demonstrate your understanding. If you are able to define all these terms, then you will be doing great. So let me start off by first of all asking, and we have the new microphone in here, so I'm hoping it will pick up a lot better for me to hear your questions. So would anybody like to take a look at those lists of items at the bottom of the actual terms? And if there are any that jump out at you that you say, I don't know what they mean, can you let me know? Yes.
Where's that document you're talking about?
Hold on, I turn up my volume. Okay, ask it again.
Yeah.
Oh.
We didn't know what it's called.
Yeah. Yeah, where is it?
Where is what?
What is it called?
Like the list of terms you're talking about on Moodle.
Okay. So go into your class and at the very top where it says readings, reading guides, it says chapter 1 guide.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And right underneath that is the chapter 2. Thank you
All right.
for asking.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll give you a moment to look. And while you're looking over it's real fast. Megan, can
Yes, ma'am.
you raise your hand for me? Oh, thank you. Bailey,
Yes.
Jeremiah, absent. Alec,
Here.
Savion,
Here.
Lauren.
Here.
Lauren, I used your name a lot in the Monday video.
I like that.
Did you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. Charles,
Yeah.
Here.
No, it's online.
Charles,
Those are the videos that say like lecture and a date. Some of the dates are Mondays, and then you're supposed to watch those on Monday.
so Charles is absent. Dennis,
Here.
that's the question again, where are the videos? So thank you for asking that, and thank you for telling him where they're located. You see where they are in the module?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, good. So looking at that list, anything jump out at you like, oh my gosh, I don't know what that means? Chapter 1. Communication studies. Okay. Then go ahead to your text. So on page 8, it talks about, from the very, very beginning, we have to make the distinction between interpersonal and T-R-A, personal communication. And that's our foundation. Remembering with that process model that I showed in the early part of the course. And that's a good review, all right? So remember, we've got sender of the message and receiver of a message. And remember, we have the encode and the decoding, right? And then we've got this channel. Wait, let's do it this way. All right, so we have the channel. We've got a message that's going to be sent. Hopefully you will remember all those elements and you'll go back in your notes and take a look at that diagram, because remember we also talked about context and all those elements. But to go back to what I was saying, it all begins with encoding, because encoding is where you are taking language to identify what is your feeling, all right, and your thought. But it all originates inside the brain, either on a conscious level or a subconscious level or an unconscious level. So when you are looking at this, that's what we're talking about in chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called the process of communication. If you were to take this class, if you got a degree in communication studies, you would have an entire course on just chapter 1. And in that course, it would go into all of the neuro-linguistic understanding of what this means. It's extremely scientific, and it really is pretty fascinating. It's also one of the more difficult classes in communication studies because it brings in the medical science of how we formulate information from understanding our neurology and the connections, synapses, and everything of the brain. Luckily, you don't have to cover that in this class. So the intrapersonal, though, is very important, and that's what we really go into detail in chapter 2. So interpersonal communication is generally between one and one other person, might sometimes include a second who plays a secondary role or character, but generally it is looking at a one-to-one, not one-on-one, but one-to-one conversation. So if we skip over to chapter 11, you can see that to page 11, you can see where this model that I drew for you is defined in text with every one of those words of what they mean. Now, you'll remember that I talked about there were 3 models, all right? And they all serve a different purpose. So there is one-way communication, and that's just the transmission model. That just means I'm going to speak, and I hope that somebody's out there getting the information. I do not expect any feedback, all right? There may be things that get in the way, such as you not knowing where a document is, or that you don't know where the videos are, just like we discovered today. Those are legitimate examples of noise, all right? So those are things that are going to prevent you from understanding, all right? So we have a lot of different types of noise, and we also have, along with the transmission model, the very popular CMC type of communication, which represents computer mediated, all right? So that's social media, that's television, that's everything along those lines. Okay, then let's jump over to page 15, and it talks about the interaction model, all right? And that clearly means that there is going to be some feedback. There's going to be, I say something, you respond to it back and forth. And there is a little definition there, but the big difference between this one and this one is what's known as feedback. Okay? And that feedback is critical because the feedback can be both verbal and nonverbal, right? It can also be conscious and unconscious. Now, I mentioned that they always have what's known as context. And context is going to refer to who, when, where, why, which is your purpose of conversing, and of course the how. So all of that provides an environment for deciding what you say and how you say it, and when you say it, and to whom do you say it, etc. There's also that psychological context, and the psychological context is very much driven by what is in your head, all right? How are you feeling at the moment of what you're going to say? Are you outraged, right? So those are factors that can come into play. And then they have what's known as a transaction okay? And a way to think of this, if you'll remember, is like the basketball game going on in a court. The transaction model means that there's a whole lot of different communication occurring at the same time. This one could just be a Snapchat. This one could just be a text to a friend. Excuse me. Excuse me, thank you. But the transaction model is really how most of us communicate most of the time, where we are thinking about a whole, not thinking about, but we are semi-aware or very aware of what's going on around us at the same time. So you think about a basketball game. There's opposing players, there's a referee, there's stands, people in the stands who are watching, coaches who are yelling, players talking to each other, both with signals, verbally, as well as with words. All of that is what is recognized as transactional. And the reason is that it's a cross of actions. That's what it means by transacting. I'm going to do something that may affect you, may not, but may affect another person on the court or sitting in the stands or something like that. So there is an exchange. If you think of transaction, there's an exchange of going on. Okay. And it is diagrammed and explained in more detail on page 17. And the key factor for this is that it's simultaneous, senders and receivers. This one, there could be major time between, right? I send an email in the morning, you may read it this afternoon, and then you may put it out of your mind, and then tomorrow morning, send me a question about it. That's this kind, okay? But in the transaction, it means it's all going on at the same time. So those are the key differentiators. On page 18, it talks about some additional kinds of context. So there might be the social setting. How you communicate with your friends is going to be very different than how you are going to communicate when you walk into your professor's office. There's also relational context. How you communicate with members of your family are going to be different, but even within that relationship, how you communicate with your siblings might be very, very different than how you communicate with parents. And then there is, of course, cultural context. And the cultural context is what your term project is all about. That's where you are looking at the bigger picture, try and understand how to communicate with people who are different from you. Yeah. Any questions so far? All right, so jumping over to the principles, we're going to talk a little bit about why in the world are we studying this. Hopefully you started to see that the whole purpose of studying this is for your healthy relationships at home, with significant others, on the job, in business enterprise, exchange of information, etc. So it's an opportunity for you to hone your skill set to make you an effective communicator. And again, that's why many of you have it as a requirement of your job. This is also highly sought after by employers. If anybody's wondering what to get a degree in, communication studies is an excellent degree that employers love to see. All right. So when you look over on page 23, there's a really valuable term to know called communication competence. And competence is the quality of which a person is able to perform a skill, right? So if a person is competent at driving a car, then they are good enough to get a license and hopefully not get in a car accident. So that's a competency, all right? And then you can even narrow those competencies down to specific, such as you're able to understand the signs of the road, okay? Competency of understanding the rules and the laws based on signage. Okay? Some of it is the rules and the laws based on just how to drive, such as who yields to whom when you come to that four-way intersection where there is one stop sign. So that kind of thing. Well, that's the same thing we do in communication studies, is we look at the competencies of somebody. And as a consultant, that's what I do when I am coaching executive leaders who don't necessarily know how to communicate to certain kinds of people, whether it's their employees, or their colleagues, or their customers, or their superiors, supervisors, or a vendor, et cetera, et cetera. So, or male to female, female to male. So there's lots of competencies that we in communication studies like to hone in on. So if you think back on your the video that I talked about on Monday in that lecture, part of having a discussion with the other is to try and understand the competencies of the culture. So, for instance, taboos. What is a taboo in another culture that you want to make sure you don't commit that taboo, right? Because that could alienate you from the person, possibly get you punched in the nose by the person, uh, ostracized, so nobody will ever talk to you again, all kinds of ramifications. So having communication competence in cultural communication is critically important today. Um, Another purpose for studying communication is to understand that we all have needs. And each one of you have different kinds of needs at different times, right? And there are different needs that are explained here. I talked about those in the videos to identify what are instrumental goals, your relationship maintenance kinds of goals to, as a need to keep a relationship together, and even your self-presentation goals. How do you want to look to a prospective supervisor? Or how do you want to look when you've um, gotten in trouble with your parents and you want to minimize the amount of consequences, etc. So in here, it goes through all the different kinds of goals or needs that you have, and you should be able to look at those and recognize them. One of the unusual terms that you probably have never heard of before this class is DTR. And that refers to defining the relationship conversations. And those are sometimes exciting and wonderful, and other times disappointing and cause hurt, all right? Because one person may be expecting a relationship to go in one particular direction, while the other person is thinking, no, I don't want to go there, all right? I'm not ready for a commitment, or I'm not ready for marriage, or I'm not ready for seeing only one person, etc. So oftentimes you have to define the relationship. We use that also in business. If you have an employee who is being coached with attitude issues, well, there's a relationship problem going on there. And so a discussion has to be, let's define the relationship. And the relationship is, you are an employee and I am the manager. And as such, I have these set of responsibilities and you have these responsibilities. And I expect when you are communicating with me that you will keep all those responsibilities that I have in mind and speak with me, and then you would coach the person in tone of voice, eye contact, or rolling the eye, body language, etc. Okay. And then there's more information about your self-presentation. And on your self-presentation goals, remember that this is very much about what's the persona that you want to project. And you get to choose. So when you are walking into a classroom, you're going to present yourself in one way. And when you go on a date, excuse me, you'll present yourself in another way, obviously. Now, I hope some of you actually went and looked up the site, the AICI, or, excuse me, presenting yourself and choosing how you want to present yourself. And again, you have some goals. Hold on. I hate when this happens. I get these tickles. So just remember that when you're working on presenting yourself, that there are multiple goals working on at the same time. At the bottom of 26, it demonstrates again what was already defined as your instrumental, your relational, and your self-presentation are all goals working in concert. And then on the next couple of pages, it's going to talk about what are your needs. In all aspects of what you're doing, there's going to be your needs. Your needs have to be met. That's why you communicate. That's why we're social animals. That's why we reach out and talk to people. And there's, again, different kinds of needs. You need to have food, right? Your physical needs. You need shelter. You've got to negotiate with a landlord for your rent or to even get an apartment. You need your many of your instrumental needs, which is you want people to support you. You want to get an answer to a question. And some of those instrumental needs is a lot of what we talked about in terms of compliance gaining. And on page 28 is that list of all the different types of compliance gaining strategies that we all use. Some of us use one or two more than the others, but they're all part of being instrumental or being a tool in our toolkit of how we get what we want. We also have identity needs. How we dress may determine what kind of a group we want to be associated with. If you think about a transgender who has one gender label given, but that's not the identity that that person wants or feels that they are, in which case then they will work to change that identity, especially on the outside, so that they will be treated like the identity that they want to be treated. So that's on an extremely important and elemental basis. But we also use it when, if I'm going in for a client, I'm going to be wearing one of my suits, as opposed to when I come in and teach a class. So we ended this chapter by looking at how communication is a process. And again, this whole chapter is about the processes for communication. And there are what we call maxims for communication studies. And the first one is that sometimes we say what we mean and we mean it. And other times we say things that we did not mean to say it at all, or it came out completely wrong. And that's the intentional, unintentional. Sometimes it's very conscious and unconscious. Oftentimes your body language is saying one thing, all right? But you're saying, no, I do want to talk. I do want to talk. So you're saying you want to talk, but your body language is, but you're not going to listen. And even your talking is going to be biased. Communication is irreversible. Once it's out there, it cannot be taken back. All you can do is mitigate it or try and apologize. Communication is not repeatable. You can do a video of it, but you will never repeat the exact essence of the experience. I've given birth to 2 children. They were both very different experiences. Very happy, very wonderful, but very different for different reasons. So you can't really repeat it exactly. And of course, communication is governed by rules and norms. The most important element in this chapter is you cannot communicate. All right, and this is by Dr. Václavic out of Stanford University and the Palo Alto group, who commented or observed that no matter how you want to just remain under wraps or undercover or not there, it's not going to happen. You're always communicating. Now, some of you did a good job of even bringing in emphatic communication as something you want to look at for studying the other on your term project. This is a great piece of information to use for understanding cultural differences. And emphatic communication is just those rules and norms that a group or a culture have in what is acceptable prelude to real communication and conclusions. So it's the hi, how are you? It's the bye, see you later kinds of things. And that's chapter 1. Any questions about chapter 1? Right. Chapter 2 will go pretty fast because that's the chapter where we did a whole lot of activities. So again, scroll down in your book to chapter 2. Look at your list of terms. Are there any terms in chapter 2 that jump out at you? Okay, well, if there are, let me know. So we're going to start off in this chapter by understanding that it's the intrapersonal communication, as well as how we take who we are and what we let the outside world see. All right. So we went over the self-concept, and the self-concept is really important because it is who we think we are, right? And there is the whole theory of Cooley's looking glass self that really hones in on the concept that who we think we are is a direct reflection, like a mirror, of how people treat us, of what people say to us, how they don't say something to us, etc. So very complex, a fantastic theory. I spent a lot of time on that, so I want you to look at that in the videos if you need it. But how we do that is driven by what's listed on page 35, which are a number of different kinds of theories. So our social comparison theory is just that, where we're going to compare ourselves against other people within our social stratus, whether it's student to student, college student, compared to high school student. So it might be within, it might be out, etc. When we do that, we oftentimes evaluate or judge ourselves based on inferiority or superiority. Am I better than that person, or is that person better than me? And we do that by honing in on what's similar, what's alike about us, what's really different. And are those differences superior or inferior? If you look over on page 36, it then gets into self-esteem. And self-esteem is defined there as the judgments and evaluations that we make about our self-concept. All right, so our self-esteem is whether or not we think it's high or low. Do we think a lot about ourselves? Do we think highly of ourselves? Or do we think that we're, not such a great person, or we are too shy, or something like that? On page 37, it talks about some of the factors that drive how we do that evaluation of ourselves. And one of them is the concept of self-efficacy. And boy, do people use that on the news all the time. Self-efficacy refers to those judgments that people make about their ability and how we make about our ability to perform a task. Okay? So, public speaking. You may have high self-efficacy, where you believe that you have a high degree of skill sets in giving public speeches. Or you might say, oh no, that's not my skill set. I'm not good at that. I don't want to ever take public speaking class. That is like nightmare, nightmare, nightmare. And so you would see yourself as not being very efficient, not being very effective, not being seeing that as a strength. All right, over on page 39, we also have what's known as the self-discrepancy. So remember that there are the 3 cells, and those 3 cells are identified as our actual or our real self, and then we have our ideal self, what we would really, really like to be, and that's if we were perfect, what would that look like? And the other is the ought. Okay, well, this is how we should be. This is how we ought to be. All right, so this is how we really are. This is what we wish we could be. But this is our downfalls. And this is really pointing to the things that we are not doing well and we ought to do better or differently. Okay. There are some explanations, and so this would be good to look at for your test to make sure that you understand on page 40 the different discrepancies that could come up with all of these, and that was also explained in a detailed lecture. The next section talks about what influences our self-esteem or our self-awareness. And those are all explained in detail. So your social, your family, how are you motivated? Are you motivated internally, yourself, intrinsic, or are you motivated by fear or threats or rewards, which is your extrinsic motivators? Your attributions, how do you give praise to yourself, or what kind of praise do you listen to? Or the absence of an attribution, like the one I said, well, you won the race. Well, yeah, you won the race because the other people weren't very fast. Okay, that's a negative attribution. That's basically saying that you don't have the skill sets, right? So attributions are important to look at on page 42. Page 42 also talks about the self-enhancement bias. And that's where we put our best foot forward. And that's where we do everything that we can to make ourselves look really good to others, whether it's performing a task or how we dress, whatever. All right. And there's different ways of how we do that. It's very dependent on the economics, on what kind of money you have in terms of what you enhance. So it can be very deceiving. Your race and your gender obviously are going to influence who you are, so you want to look at that, and that's part of what will be helpful on your project. And also media. Media is sometimes my enemy, because media says that I should be, at least 6 inches taller, and I should weigh at least 30 pounds lighter. Well, I don't, all right? So the media, and especially advertisement, really creates unreachable standards or expectations for average people. And so always listen to media and advertising carefully. And remember that media and advertising really pits you against another. Okay, so if you drink this, you will have more energy, okay? That's a social comparison. And it really hones in on what it says you need to be better, thinner, beautiful, etc. All right. And there are some great videos that I encourage you to watch. Self-presentation is all in there. What do you do in order to get people to like you? And the use of Facebook and Snapchat, that's all explained. And then we spent quite a bit of time um, on your how do you improve your self-image. So we did quite a few videos on that, and I gave you lots of different opportunities for looking at that. You should know the term schemata and schema. You should understand those. And self-fulfilling prophecies, I explained what those are. And again, go through your list of all the different ways that you can improve your self-esteem. We did a lot about that social penetration theory. So remember that we talked about Shrek and the breadth, the depth, and his onion, along with self-disclosure. How comfortable are you in letting people know who you are? And we did that by exploring the Johari window. So I spent almost a whole class on the Johari window, and you may want to look at that one as a review. And the whole goal is to shrink that blind spot, all right, so that you hear the praise as well as constructive criticism so that you can self-improve. And that's perception checking. So that's the way that you're going to check your perception of yourself against other people's perceptions of you to find out where it's true, especially if you have low self-esteem. Talks about self-disclosure to know when and where, so to make sure you don't overshare TMI, too much information to the wrong person, because sometimes it can and will be held against you, so you have to be smart in how you do that. And then there's some more information about the different types of attributions. So on page 64, it talks about dispositional attributions. I don't think I went over this very much. So it's that commentary that connects the cause of why you tell something, your disclosure, to how you think, the personality of the way you think. And remember the MBTI. Okay, so those predispositions of behaviors. So if you look back at that whole discussion on the MBTI that I gave you in that video, it's going to give you some insights into all of the different types of attributions, okay? And there's interpersonal, there's situational, and especially if you've got a report, look at the report that I gave you, because there's different situations to explain how you're going to attribute or give yourself credit for skills or items that need improvement. All right, and that's your test. So, any other questions? Any questions? Are you guys ready? All right. Well, good job. Good luck. And I will see you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.